Good afternoon to everyone joining us from the waiting room. This is a World Oregon webinar. We are here today with Michael Mandelbaum, author of The 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy. I'm Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs for World Oregon, and I'm glad you could all be with us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a really big thanks to everyone who joined us for the 2022 International Speakers Series, which just concluded the other night with photojournalist Lindsay Addario talking about her experiences covering conflict and humanitarian crisis over the last 25 years. It was a wonderful series this year, which we could not have done without all of your support and attendance, so thank you. We are going to go into our summer months here at World Oregon, which means we do fewer public programs because ostensibly the weather gets nicer. The saying is that summer begins July 4th here in Oregon. We are turning our attention to youth exchange and exchanges with folks from around the globe in person for the first time in a couple of years. So you can find out more about our hosting and our programs at worldoregon.org. And I'm glad you could join us today for this conversation on the 4 ages of American foreign policy: weak power, great power, superpower, and hyperpower. And I'm really, really happy that we could have Michael Mandelbaum with us today to discuss the evolution of foreign policy through these 4 distinct periods. I'm going to do just a brief intro, then I'm going to hand the floor over to Michael, and then think as he is giving his talk about the questions you'd like to ask, and we will have a really, hopefully rich and engaging Q&A following his talk. Michael Mandelbaum is the Christian A. Herter Professor Emeritus of American Foreign Policy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is the author of 16 previous books, including Mission Failure, The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, and with Thomas Friedman, That Used to Be Us. You can get a copy of The 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy from our partners at Broadway Books, and I will put the link into the chat in just a moment. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Michael. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to all of you who are participating in this webinar. It's a pleasure to be with such a distinguished group. Before I start my remarks, I want to do 2 things. First, I want to hold up the book so you can recognize it in a bookstore. Doesn't come through all that well on Zoom, but you get the idea. And second, I want to say that this book, The 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, has an Oregon connection. It is dedicated to a number of my college classmates, among them James N. Gardner, an eminent Oregonian. Alas, Jim Gardner died recently, but those of you who knew him, and I'm sure there are some in our audience today, knew him as a fine lawyer, a fine public servant, and a fine writer, and a wonderful human being. So I'm glad to have had the opportunity to honor his memory in this way. The book, The 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, covers 250 years from 1765 to 2015. It goes all the way from the Stamp Act to the Iran deal. And I had 3 purposes in writing it. The first purpose was and is simply to tell the story, to describe and analyze the major events and most important personalities in American foreign policy over those 25 centuries. The second purpose was to engage with the principal controversies in the history of American foreign policy. So I addressed such issues as, why did the 13 colonies rebel against the British Empire at the end of the 18th century? Why was there a Cold War, and why did it end as it did? And which presidents were successful and which unsuccessful in the conduct of American foreign policy? Spoiler alert, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison do not come off well. The third purpose of the book is to draw out the most important themes that run through these 250 years of foreign policy. What are the most important themes? Well, the history of American foreign policy, like the history of everything, exhibits both continuities and changes. And the book is built on the most important continuities and the most significant changes in the history of American foreign policy. So I'll say something about each of them. First, the continuities. There are, in my judgment, three important continuities in the history of American foreign policy. In its history from the 18th century to the 21st, the United States has been unusually ideological, unusually economic, and unusually democratic. By unusually ideological, I mean that more than other countries, the United States has sought in its foreign policy to promote its own political values in other countries. Most importantly, peace among countries and democracy within them. Now, the United States is not the only country in history to seek to promote its own values abroad, and it's not the only country to seek to promote these particular values. Such an effort at promotion was a part of the foreign policy of Great Britain in the 19th century and has been a part of the foreign policies of the countries of Western Europe since the middle of the 20th century. Nor has this been the only American approach to foreign policy. In fact, since the beginning of the 20th century, when the United States first began to make its presence felt in the international order in a major way, the United States has had two major approaches to the conduct of foreign policy, each associated with an important early 20th century president. The first is sometimes called realism or realpolitik. It's associated with Theodore Roosevelt. It emphasizes power, and it regards the best possible international configuration as a stable balance of power. Theodore Roosevelt spent much of his presidency trying to contrive such a balance in East Asia. The second principal approach is sometimes called idealism. It involves the promotion of American political ideas. It's associated with Woodrow Wilson, and so it has come to be known as Wilsonianism. Wilson sought not a balance of power, but a concert of power, which he believed could be embodied in the international organization that he founded in the wake of World War I, the League of Nations, but that the United States did not join. Now, these two approaches to foreign policy have sometimes conflicted. And when they have conflicted, like most countries in most places for most of history, America has chosen to defend its interests rather than promote its values. Realism has usually trumped idealism. But Wilsonian idealism has never disappeared. It has always been an important part of American foreign policy. It has always been on the agenda. Americans have always wished to promote their values abroad, even if they haven't always made that the center of their relations with other countries. And this attachment to Wilsonian is one of the things that has made American foreign policy distinctly American. As for the second principal continuity, by unusually economic, I mean that more than other countries, the United States has sought to achieve political goals using economic instruments. This goes back to the very beginning of the Republic. As we all recall, the American Revolution was spurred by the imposition by the British Parliament of taxes on the 13 colonies that the colonials regarded as unjust. An early response to those taxes was a boycott of British goods. The idea was to put pressure on British merchants who were selling these goods so that they would, in turn, put pressure on their parliament to rescind the taxes. And in a couple of instances, this actually worked. Until the 20th century, trade was the economic instrument of choice in trying to promote American interests and attain political objectives beyond the borders of the United States. But beginning in the 20th century, the United States used the export of capital for this purpose. This began in the administration of William Howard Taft with what came to be known as dollar diplomacy. It reached what was probably its finest hour with the European Recovery Program of 1947, popularly known as the Marshall Plan. But Americans have relied on the export of capital to try to achieve political goals recurrently ever since. In the 1990s, for example, the American government used the International Monetary Fund for this purpose. A final continuity is that the United States has conducted an unusually democratic foreign policy. By that, I mean that the public has had unusually wide scope for influencing both the formation and the implementation of America's relations with other countries beyond its borders. In the great powers of Europe, foreign policy was the province of the monarchy and the aristocracy, but of course the United States had neither, and so the public has played an unusually large role. It has been especially important in matters of war and peace. The American public has helped to start wars and also helped to stop them. There is a recurrent phenomenon in American history in which a dramatic event occurs, most often abroad, but sometimes at home, which galvanizes the American public and makes the world seem suddenly more dangerous than before, calling for a more robust American foreign policy, which has sometimes involved going to war. For example, in 1898, the destruction of the American battleship Maine in Havana Harbor created a public climate in which pushed the United States to war against Spain, thus the Spanish-American War of 1898. A couple of decades later, the German submarine sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in 1915 gave the American public an entirely different view of Germany's role in World War I and paved the way for the American entry into that war against Germany 2 years later. And more recently, of course, we all remember the attacks on Washington and New York City of September 11, 2001, which led to 2 American wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But public discontent with wars has also brought them to an end, or at least forced the American government to withdraw American troops from them. The war in Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq became unpopular. The public turned against them and compelled the American government to withdraw troops from all 3 countries. Now, I should note that in all 3 of these cases, the public did not turn against the causes for which the wars were being fought. It decided rather that pursuing those causes, pursuing those aims, was too expensive, expenses being denominated in American casualties. And it wanted the American government to get out, and the American government did get out. This is related to a point that I make in the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, namely that every American war, without exception, has provoked dissent and protest, which means that anti-war agitation is as American as apple pie. American foreign policy has also been unusually democratic in that there are multiple channels through which the public and indeed foreign governments can try to influence the conduct of that foreign policy. The White House, the presidency, of course, is usually the main channel, but there are also the three great departments of state: defense, treasury, and state. And in addition, there is the Congress. So there are multiple avenues to affect American foreign policy, which enables the public to play an even greater role than it would without these channels. And because the public plays such a large role, American foreign policy has sometimes seemed to other countries to be volatile and unpredictable, and other countries have misjudged the United States. For example, the imperial government of Japan did not expect the American response to the attacks on Pearl Harbor to be so fierce and so long-lasting. The United States fought until Japan surrendered unconditionally. To give another example, Saddam Hussein surely did not anticipate, when he sent his troops into Kuwait in 1990, that the United States would react by mustering a worldwide coalition against him, sending 500,000 troops to the Persian Gulf, and forcibly evicting his soldiers from Kuwait. Well, those are the continuities. What of the changes? The most important changes in American foreign policy have come about because of the steady increase in the relative power of the United States in the international system. The steady increase in power has given the United States consecutively 4 different international roles, and those international roles are the subtitle of the book. Between 1765 and 1865, the United States was a weak power. Its goal was to defend its independence and to ward off the great powers of Europe so that it could expand across the North American continent. From 1865 to 1945, the United States was a great power, and it did the 2 things that great powers tend to do in the world. It cooperated with, but also conflicted with, the other great powers, and it carved out a sphere of influence of its own, the American sphere of influence at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, encompassing Central America and the Eastern Pacific. Now, the United States was an explicitly imperial power for a time, by which I mean that it did control peoples and territory without their consent outside the borders of the United States. This came about as a result of the war against the Spanish in 1898, as a result of which the United States annexed the Philippines and also took control of Hawaii and Puerto Rico and established a kind of suzerainty over Cuba. But compared with the great empires of Europe, the American empire was rather short-lived, was small in its territorial reach, was rather half-hearted. Americans didn't care much about it, and did not play a major role in American life. So America was an imperial power, but not much of an imperial power. Well, the third era of American foreign policy ran from 1945 to 1990, and in that era, the United States competed with the rival superpower, the Soviet Union, in political and economic terms all around the world. There was no corner of the planet that was off limits to the Cold War. And the United States competed with the Soviet Union in amassing weaponry, including nuclear weaponry. The fourth and final period, the fourth and final age with which the book deals, is the era of the American hyperpower. The term comes from the French foreign minister Hubert Védrine, who early in this period termed the United States an hyperpuissance. This was a period in which the United States had no serious rival and faced no serious security challenges. This was the era in American history where the United States had the maximal freedom of action. Now, it's obvious that war has played an important role in the history of American foreign policy. So let me say something about war. You can see that war has served as a kind of midwife from one era of American foreign policy to the next. The American victory in the War of Independence, or as we tend to call it, the Revolutionary War, made the United States an independent country and therefore able to conduct an independent foreign policy. The outcome of the Civil War paved the way for the emergence of the United States in the international system as a great power. American participation in the winning coalition in World War II led to the emergence of the United States as one of the world's two superpowers. And finally, the leadership of the United States in the winning coalition in the Cold War made the United States the world's only hyperpower. Now, I want to say two other things about the role of war in the history of American foreign policy. First, the United States has fought a number of wars, 12 serious conflicts by my count, as well as numerous smaller engagements. But in my judgment, I don't think it's fair to say that the United States has been a warlike country. Indeed, in virtually every one of the wars in which it has engaged, the United States has been fighting, at least from its own perspective, on the defensive for defensive reasons. Now, it's true that not every country has seen it this way, but I think it is fair to say that in making the case that America has fought generally for defensive purposes, the United States does have a case to make, that it does have a good case, with one exception. The exception is the Mexican War of 1846 to 1848. That was a war of territorial conquest, and it brought into the United States, what is now the American Southwest, as well as most of the American West, although not Oregon, but including California. The second observation about the history of war in American foreign policy is this. In its three most important wars, the United States has been fortunate in having excellent commanders in chief. In the Revolutionary War, George Washington proved to be an adept battlefield commander, and adept mainly at avoiding battle with the militarily superior British forces. And Washington also served as a potent symbol of the new nation, not just for the soldiers in the Continental Army, but also for the inhabitants of the 13 colonies. In the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln understood the military requirement for his political goal of keeping the Union together. And that military requirement was smashing the Confederate Army. He found a general, Ulysses S. Grant, who could carry out that strategy, and Lincoln persevered in that strategy until a successful conclusion, despite the fact that the war was extremely costly. As for the third important war in American history, World War II, here again, America was fortunate in having Franklin Roosevelt as the commander-in-chief. Roosevelt had a series of very difficult strategic decisions to make. And the decisions that he did make came in for criticism at the time and subsequently. And yet, as I say in my chapter on the Second World War and on Roosevelt as foreign policymaker in the book, in my judgment, Roosevelt made the right decisions. For example, between the fall of France in 1940 and American entry into World War II in December 1947 after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt took pains to give as much assistance as he could to the British in fighting Nazi Germany. And after June 22nd, 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Roosevelt also sent assistance to the Soviets, despite the fact that there was serious opposition to doing so in the United States. Then, when America entered the war, Roosevelt opted to concentrate American military efforts in Europe. He chose a Europe first strategy, despite the fact that the attacks that had precipitated America into the war had come from Asia. Once in the war, Roosevelt decided that the initial major American military operation should take place in North Africa. This was called Operation Torch, and he made that decision over the protests of his military advisors, who regarded North Africa as a diversion for the main business of war, which was getting to Germany as quickly as possible. But Roosevelt believed, at least from his perspective as commander-in-chief, it was an important belief, and I believe probably a correct belief, that the American public had to see its army in operation in the calendar year 1942 in order to sustain domestic support for the war. Finally, Roosevelt chose June 1944 as the date for the great Anglo-American Canadian cross-channel invasion of France, so-called Operation Overlord. And indeed, D-Day, as it's come to be known, took place on June 6th. He chose that time despite the objections of one of his two major wartime partners, Joseph Stalin, that the invasion should take place earlier, at the earliest date conceivable, and despite the wishes of his other great wartime ally, Winston Churchill, that D-Day Operation Overlord be postponed, perhaps indefinitely. Now let me say let me say one other word about the commanders-in-chief, and that is that each one of them was very good at what is the most important job of the American commander-in-chief in wartime, and that is keeping the country committed to fighting the war. Well, now a final word about the recent past and the present. In the first 3 ages of American foreign policy, the United States was remarkably successful. In the era of America as a weak power, the country did defend its independence and expand across North America. As a great power, the United States played an important role, a very important role in the second instance, in winning the 2 world wars of the first half of the 20th century. During the Cold War, the United States led the coalition that overcame the Soviet Union and communism. But the fourth era, the age of the American hyperpower, was different. The United States was not successful. Why was that? Well, the United States made some mistakes in foreign policy in this era. In my judgment, it was a serious mistake to expand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization toward Russia's borders, despite promises not to do so, in the wake of the objections of then Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who, unlike the current Russian president, was a Democrat. And of course, the war the United States fought in Iraq did not turn out as Americans anticipated or wished. But there was a larger problem with American foreign policy in the post-Cold War era, the era of the American hyperpower. That problem was that the principal project in that era was an American effort around the world to install, either directly in countries the Americans occupied or indirectly in countries where the United States did not have that kind of leverage, a certain kind of government, our kind of government. We sought to install a government that protected human rights, fostered prosperity, remained at peace with its neighbors, and practiced democracy internally in a series of countries, including those we occupied and also in China and Russia by indirect economic means. And in these cases, we failed. The reason that America failed is that in order to have that kind of government, a country, a society requires certain preconditions. The kind of government we have and the kind of government we want for other countries requires a certain set of political values. It requires as well a certain set of economic and political institutions. And it requires experience in operating those institutions. The countries where we tried to foster our kind of government did not have them. And that's why we failed. In this effort, America was undertaking a noble and laudable goal, but a goal that in the end could not succeed because we were undertaking, in effect, mission impossible. Well, what of the present? We are now beyond the fourth age of American foreign policy and launched into a fifth one, the contours of which are just becoming clear. We don't know what it will be like because we don't know what the future will bring, but one prediction can, I think, safely be made. The future of American foreign policy in this fifth era, whatever it comes to be called, will be determined by three things. First, America's relative power in the international system. Second, the characteristically American ideological, economic, and democratic approaches to the conduct of foreign policy. And third, and finally, last but certainly not least, the unpredictable contingencies of human history. Well, thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to try to answer any and all of your questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Michael. My apologies, I lost internet for a moment, but I think I caught it at the right moment. Let's just jump in a little bit. We recently had historian Gary Gerstle talking about the rise and fall of the neoliberal order. And as we look around at geopolitics in a world struggling to get back on its feet in the face of post-pandemic populism, weakening democracy, and climate crisis, have we reached a cul-de-sac with regard to neoliberalism and our standing?
Well, of course, it depends on what you mean by neoliberalism. I will assume that neoliberalism means basically democracy, liberal politics around the world, and also free trade. We are in what some people call a democratic recession. There was a great wave of democratization beginning in the 1970s with the conversion of Portugal from authoritarian to democratic rule, continuing at the end of the 20th century in Latin America, and of course with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. There has been something of a retreat, but we haven't, as a world, as an international community, retreated all the way. There have been problems in operating the American political system, but I don't think that that has tarnished forever or even decisively now the appeal of democracy. I would say the major stumbling block to the spread of democracy is not that people around the world don't want it, but rather that governments include people who govern in authoritarian fashion and are determined to continue to retain all powers for themselves. China and Russia are democracies for a variety of reasons, but one important reason, the first reason, is that they are governed by people who are willing to shoot anybody who tries to bring about democracy. So although we haven't seen the continuation of the surge in democracy at the end of the last century, and although we have seen in some places a kind of retreat from democracy, I don't think it's at all appropriate to write democracy off. Democracy is still going strong. I believe that democracy is the goal of many countries, of many people in countries where they are forcibly prevented from having it. And I don't think that the future is necessarily destined to be unkind to democracy. Now, as for trade, there has also been a backlash against trade because trade, free trade, in general, on the whole, in some, penalizes the country, benefits the countries engaged in it, but it does penalize some people in those countries, and those are the people who have an incentive to organize and protest against free trade. That's been the case, incidentally, since the middle of the 19th century when Great Britain inaugurated free trade. So we've seen a kind of partial retreat from free trade, from globalization. But here again, the retreat hasn't gone all the way. We still live in a very globalized world, and I think we will continue to do so as we work out ways, in effect, to have our cake and eat it too, to have maximal trade with other countries, which brings economic benefit to the United States, while protecting those who are hurt by such trade.
So a great presentation, by the way. The background is wonderful. It's really, I think, important for us to be able to look back, look where we're going, and then kind of get a sense of that. I mean, I always think of the John Steinbeck quote, how can we know it's us without our past? But everything old is new again. So lust for empire, great power struggles. Do you think we're going to see a return to the playbook of Kennan era containment? And do you think that isolating Russia is the right strategy?
Well, I think we are returning to something like containment with three differences. First of all, the countries to be contained are no longer confined to the Soviet Union. We now have a kind of containment policy, not only toward Russia, but also toward China, and to some extent toward Iran. And Iran has the potential to be a very dangerous country in the years going forward if it is allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. So that's one difference from the Cold War. And as part of that difference, incidentally, at this point, the three countries that seem to call for a policy of containment are active regionally, but not, or at least not yet, really globally. So rather than having a single global problem, we have three regional problems. A second difference with Cold War style containment is that we are not opposing an ideology like communism, like Marxism, Leninism, which promulgates both a political and an economic system entirely different from ours and aspires to spread around the world. Putin may talk about the differences between Russian culture and the West, but I think that that's just blather. He doesn't have an alternative system to propose, and neither really do the Chinese communists. The mullahs in Iran may dream of creating a global Islamic state, but that, even assuming they could do it, which I can't imagine they could, will be confined to Muslims. So that's the second change. And the third change, and in a way the most complicating one, is that in the Cold War, we had virtually no economic connections with Russia, with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was what, or the communist bloc was what economists call autarkic. It was economically self-sufficient. Well, now Russia is part of the global economy in a small way as a supplier of energy. And we felt the pain of that connection with the war in Ukraine and the efforts to sanction Russia. But even more important, China is central to the global economy. So any policy toward China, even and especially if it is a neo-containment policy, and incidentally, neo-containment policies toward all three of these countries will not be and cannot be strictly American policies. They will be policies of coalitions of countries that do not wish Russia, China, and Iran to dominate their respective regions. But any neo-containment policy toward China will have to reckon with China's major role in the global economy. And to say the least, that will not be simple.
So that brings up an old quote from John McCain. He once described Russia as a gas station masquerading as a country. Energy is certainly one of the big issues at stake with the war, but food insecurity and export, especially for the Middle East and North Africa, is something that is really rising to the surface and could become very, very dire as this conflict plays out. How do you think the US and the international community should be approaching this?
It's true that we've already felt the pinch of higher energy prices. Some of you may have read the column in the New York Times yesterday. No, it was yesterday, by my friend Thomas Friedman, writing about the war in Ukraine and having some nice references to my book, in which he closes with the speculation that if the energy embargo on Russia continues for a couple of years, and if that keeps prices higher, much higher than they would have been otherwise, that might unintentionally propel a transition to a green economy faster than anything else we've ever done or could do. Whether that will happen, of course, we don't know, but the food shortages in the poorer countries, in no small part because of the Russian blockade of Ukraine's ports on the Black Sea, so they can't ship their grain abroad, is creating a serious global geoeconomic and geopolitical problem. And it seems to me that the appropriate thing for the United States and other Western countries to do is to see what we can do to alleviate any food shortages that may arise. We used to be the largest grain exporter in the world. Canada used to be a major grain exporter, so did Argentina. I don't know what the surge capacities are now, and it's a lot harder to grow wheat at the snap of fingers than it is to produce more oil in Saudi Arabia. But clearly that is something we ought to be thinking about.
So I know that Ukraine is very much front and center on people's minds. You've written before that NATO expansion ranks as one of the greatest blunders in the history of American foreign policy. So as we're 100+ days into the war in Ukraine, is that still your assessment? And do you think that was the hair trigger for Putin's invasion?
The answer to the first part of the question is yes. I stand by my judgment at the time, and I'll return to that in a moment. The answer to the second part of the question is no, I do not believe NATO expansion was the hair trigger for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I obviously don't know what was going on in his mind, but I don't believe that he believed that Ukraine was about to join NATO, nor do I think that he really believed that if Ukraine did join NATO, that would constitute a military threat to Russia. And I think Ukraine as a Western country does constitute a political threat to him because it offers the Russian people a neighboring model of a different way of going about governing and organizing the economy, a better way. And should the Russian people be persuaded that they wanted a Western form of government and political economic organization, that would be the end for Putin. Moreover, I doubt that Putin really believed that Ukraine was about to join NATO, because he had numerous conversations before the war began with the French president Emmanuel Macron, and Macron would have assured him that Ukraine would not join NATO, and Macron was in a position to convey that assurance because he has a veto. So I don't believe that this war is about NATO expansion. The reason I and many other people opposed NATO expansion in the 1990s was because Russia then was headed toward democracy. And we feared that NATO expansion, which galvanized both the Russian political class and the Russian public against the West, would throw Russia off that course and move it in an anti-Western direction. And alas, I fear, that is what happened. The expansion of NATO contributed to what happened by contributing to the kind of foreign policy that Putin has carried out. And by the way, he has carried out an aggressive foreign policy, always blaming the aggressive designs of the West to justify what he's doing to the Russian public, because they turned against the United States by virtue of NATO expansion. The initial NATO expansion made Putin's justifications for the war credible with the Russian public, which is the audience that he cares about. The argument in favor, in retrospect, of having opposed NATO expansion in the 1990s is that if we hadn't expanded, we wouldn't have had the invasion of Ukraine. We wouldn't have had the bellicose Russian foreign policy that preceded it, and we might not even have had Putin. Now, of course, that's an historical counterfactual, and we will never know what would have happened. But I will say that those of us who opposed NATO expansion at the time said that we opposed it because we feared that indeed would happen. And the people responsible for NATO expansion, the Clinton administration at the time, assured one and all that it could never happen. And of course, it has happened.
You know, I'm reminded when you talk about the 90s and that period, what has become of the Partnership for Peace that NATO started in the 90s?
The Partnership for Peace was the alternative to NATO. It was a way of having a pan-European security order that everybody, including Russia, could join, that did not rule out eventual NATO membership. It was a way of buying time to see which way Russia would go. And we had a lot of time. We should have stuck with the Partnership for Peace. We would have been a lot better off if Russia, despite not expanding NATO, had veered in an authoritarian, aggressive direction. We would have had plenty of time to expand NATO and protect the countries threatened. And incidentally, if we were going to expand NATO, we have to ask why we didn't include Ukraine, which, as we can see, was the country most directly threatened. But the Clinton administration never thought of including Ukraine. There is, incidentally, a very good recent book about NATO expansion by Mary Sarati entitled Not 1 Inch, and she goes into the details of how and why the Partnership for Peace was thrown away by the American government in the 1990s.
Well, you know, thinking about the Clinton administration, you wrote a piece many, many years ago critiquing the Clinton administration's foreign policy as social work. Can you elaborate a bit on how we might have moved beyond that?
Well, I criticized that as the central focus of American foreign policy, because I believe then and I believe now that American foreign policy should first and foremost be concerned with the most important countries, the most powerful countries, the countries that can do us the most harm. The problem with social work, that is, with trying to transform countries internally, was not that they and we would not have benefited from the transformation that we were trying to bring about, but rather that it didn't work. That was the point I was making in the last part of my talk. And that was the point of a 2016 book that I wrote called Mission Failure about post-Cold War foreign policy. There's nothing wrong with hoping that other countries become more democratic. There's nothing wrong with doing whatever we can to make other countries more democratic. But we shouldn't imagine that we alone can bring democracy abroad. And we shouldn't forget that which is most important for American foreign policy.
You know, on that note, I mean, some years back, you wrote a piece called Democracy Without America, noting that virtually every president has been evangelical about spreading democracy and the American form of government. Yet I'm thinking, as we were talking before we started, that we are going to have the January 6th hearings this evening. We're seeing the weakening of that within our own borders and throughout the world. Are you hopeful that that tide is going to turn?
We are certainly more polarized now than we have been since the 1850s. That, by the way, was not the only period of American history when we were more polarized than we are today. We were more polarized in the early republic, beginning with the Jefferson administration, where Jefferson's Republican Party, which changed its name to the Democrats, which is the name by which it's been known ever since, and the opposing Federalists were at each other's throats, and each accused the other of treason. Each believed that the other was trying to overthrow the American Revolution. So this period of polarization is not entirely new. The difference is that insofar as we are domestically polarized, we will have greater difficulty in playing the international role that we have played since 1945, and that I believe is necessary for global stability and global well-being. In the early 1800s and in the 1850s, America really didn't matter in the world. Now it matters a great deal. Another point I would make is that, as I noted in a book I wrote about democracy in 2004 called Democracy's Good Name, democracy has spread not so much, not mainly, certainly, by the efforts of the democracies, but by their example. Other countries observe democracy in action and decide that that's the political system for them. So the best thing we can do to spread democracy is to project an attractive image ourselves. But I should note one other thing. One of the global strengths of democracy, and I think it's stronger than it may now appear to us, is that it is certainly not confined to the United States. Other countries, countries in Asia, countries in Africa, demonstrate that this form of government is not confined to North America and Western Europe. And it's not only for rich countries. When the Central and Eastern Europeans threw over communism in 1989, they said publicly that they wanted to join Europe. They wanted to be part of the then European community, now the European Union. In other words, they didn't have America as their role model, not that they had any objection to the United States. They had Western Europe. So we are not alone, and our travails, insofar as they blacken the image of democracy, are counterbalanced by functioning democracies in other countries.
So let's jump to the present. A couple things come to mind. What do you think the withdrawal from Afghanistan did for our foreign policy credibility internationally, especially in the Middle East?
It was certainly not helpful. And we have seen Iran behave ever more boldly. It's moving faster toward nuclear weapons. And even without the nuclear issue, Iran is trying to dominate the region, using its own military force and using proxy forces as well. The countries of the region are resisting, but they need to have the United States having their back. And after Afghanistan, they wondered whether the United States was going to do that. I hope that it will. Afghanistan was not a world-changing event. But it was a fiasco, and fiascos do hurt.
So do you have any hope for a return or a 2.0 for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action?
I think that the United States will only be able to deal effectively with the Iranian mullahs, who are ideologically driven, whose goal is to dominate the Middle East, and whose rhetoric unabashedly advocates genocide against Israel. I think that we will only be able to deal effectively with them if we have leverage of a certain kind. And that leverage is the Iranian belief that in the event that it does not comply with the international community's wishes, that it will be the subject of military force. I don't mean an American invasion of Iran. I don't think putting boots on the ground is at all indicated. But unless the Iranian leaders have some fear of a military solution by the West to their aggression and their nuclear program, they're just going to proceed as they like. I fear that they were convinced that the Obama administration would never use force and would prevent Israel from using force. They were afraid of Donald Trump for a while, but I fear that they concluded that he was mostly talk and not much action. And I fear that they have the same view of the Biden administration. I fear, in short, that if we don't have a tougher policy, which will be difficult to mount now that we are so worried, and rightly so, about China, and engaged, if only indirectly, in Russia. But if we don't have a tougher policy toward Iran, Iran will proceed to get nuclear weapons with consequences that could be awful.
Well, and you've said that the Biden administration is handicapped by a foreign policy that's very dominated by Obama administration players who got their feet wet during a post-Cold War devoid of any threats. And I believe you said we're now in a post-Cold War world. So can you dig into that a bit more, and how do we evolve that?
I'm reminded of a saying by the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who was asked what had had the greatest impact on his prime ministership. And he replied, "Events, dear boy, events. America is a status quo power. We respond to events. We've responded vigorously, and I believe appropriately, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, although before it took place, most Americans couldn't find Ukraine on a map, and many had probably never heard of it. So our goal is to try to keep the world as peaceful as possible so that countries can go about their business peacefully, and so that, as we hope, democracy can take root. I think it's also incumbent upon the United States to sustain as much globalization as is politically feasible. I believe that the abandonment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which came at the outset of the Trump administration, was a serious mistake, since that agreement would have given us serious leverage, economic leverage, to be sure, not military leverage, but very valuable leverage against China. I regret that that happened, and I hope we can keep such things to a minimum.
So we all watched with a mixture of kind of shock and sadness as career diplomats left the State Department during the last administration, and diplomacy took a really big hit. What do you think are the prospects for building state backup and rebuilding trust globally? And what advice for young people who might be interested in diplomacy and public service?
Well, we need good diplomats. And it's especially important in the United States because the United States has a global foreign policy. We're involved in every part of the world and every significant issue. And the top decision makers can't possibly know a fraction of what they need to know about all these issues and can't possibly pay attention to all of them at once. They have to count on the State Department and on our career civil servants. And that means that the country counts on them. And because the United States is so important to global security and global prosperity, the whole world counts on these people. So I hope that they don't get discouraged. Living in the Washington, D.C. area, I can say from personal experience that these are, for the most part, highly competent and dedicated people. And I hope that the country will begin to realize that, and that talented young people will decide to devote their careers to public service.
So your book ends in 2015. I'm wondering, A, were there any surprises for you as you researched and wrote the book? And B, are you thinking about a follow-up or a sequel? And what qualities or ideologies do you think are going to mark the next period of foreign policy?
Well, I won't try to speculate about the future more than I have, because we don't know the future. All I can say is that it's bound to surprise us, both pleasantly and unpleasantly. In the Cold War era, in the era of the American superpower, the relatively peaceful collapse of communism was completely unanticipated. And that's why I called the last chapter of that section of the 4 ages of American foreign policy, "A superpower dies in bed." So we shouldn't despair. As for surprises, I would say something a little bit different. I had written mainly about post-1945 American foreign policy. So I had to go back and learn or relearn the foreign policy from the revolution onward. And I found it absolutely fascinating. I hope that that comes through in my account of American foreign policy in its first 2 ages. And that's one of the reasons that, although certainly not the only one, that I encourage people to read my book.
So we've got time for one more question. We're coming up on our time. I just put into the chat where you can get a copy of Michael Mandelbaum's book. So if you ran the zoo, to paraphrase Dr. Seuss, what kind of structure and approach to foreign policy would you want to see implemented? And what would you prioritize, knowing where the US and the globe is at this moment? And even moreover, where should concerned global citizens like the WorldOregon audience be looking on the near horizon for global hotspots or issues?
I would say 2 things. First, I think we're entering a phase of more intense military competition than we've known since the Cold War. And that means that for all the money we already spend on defense, I'm afraid that we're going to have to spend more. We certainly ought to be trying to get our allies to spend more, but in the end, it's going to be the United States, which is the military mainstay of the coalition opposing the 3 revisionist powers. And as for getting involved, one of the great things about America is that for the rest of the world, America is not just the American government. It's also American citizens. It's also people who travel abroad. It's also people who work abroad. It's also people who study abroad. So I think having an international dimension to one's life is always a good thing. And because Americans are basically good people, it's also an asset for American national interests and for the foreign policy of the United States.
That is a great way to end. Again, this is The 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy by Michael Mandelbaum, Oxford University Press. Michael, thanks for such a rich conversation, so much incredible historic perspective. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We will be resuming in-person events in the fall, we hope, as long as, well, the plague holds steady and we can have some prudence and some caution in our lives. But until then, I want to ask you all to stay safe, stay well. As Mr. Rogers says, look for the helpers, and we will catch you on the next program. So thank you very much.
Thank you.